everyone, it's Michelle Lupton here, and I'm making this video after a request. I posted some cards a couple of weeks ago where I had made a background using squares of Yupo with alcohol ink on them, and I'd arranged all of those squares into a grid. And I had quite a few people comment on it and saying, how did you line them up? You couldn't have possibly done that without sort of drawing a grid all over your paper. Well, I did, and I'm going to explain how I did it in this video. It does require a little bit of eyeballing, but yeah, I'm going to show you how. So I've made 5 cards for this video, but I'm just starting off by showing you how I made the alcohol ink panels on Yupo in the first place. So my first panel that I just finished making in the video used the alcohol inks Cobalt and the Mind alloy. This second one I'm also using the Mind alloy, which is one of my favourite alloy colour. It's kind of a bronzy coppery colour. And in this one I'm actually using another blue, surprise surprise, and this one is called Monsoon. Now you can see that I am spreading out the ink using some alcohol blending solution, and I'm also using a little puffer tool to move the alcohol ink around. So if I find that there's a little bit too much intense colour in one spot, I'll just put a drop of the blending solution over the top and use my puffer to move it out of the way. Sometimes I start off with more blending solutions, sometimes a bit less. It just is random how much I tend to add, but I always end up with something interesting by the end. So this one I'm using the colours Raspberry, Wild Plum, Amethyst, and then Indigo. And I actually decided when I made this one, oh, I'm only going to use a little bit of indigo, but when I started blowing it, the indigo seemed to take over a bit. I hadn't actually planned on using any of the alloys on this one, but because the indigo took over a bit too much, I changed my mind and decided to add some of the gilded alloy. And one really important thing to know when you're using the alloys is you have to shake them up really, really well. And they actually have a little ball bearing inside the bottle, so you can hear it actually moving around, rattling around as you're shaking it. And you can see once I added that gold, it really brightened up this background and I was much happier with it. You can still see all the colours, it just wasn't sort of overwhelmed by the very, very dark purplish blue of that indigo. Okay, one more background. This one I decided I wanted to use the sterling alloy, which is a very bright silver colour. And to go with it, I thought I would go with purples, which not a colour I very often use by itself with my alcohol ink backgrounds, but I thought, why not try something a little bit unusual for me. And over the top with the alloys. So you can see sometimes I actually add the alloys when I add the colour, and other times I add the alloys after the fact. So I spread the colour out and finish the background of colour and then add the alloys over the top. So you can still get great results either way, really. It doesn't really matter. With this one, I didn't add quite as much of the blending solution to start with, so I'm just adding a little bit more as I'm spreading out these alloys. You find that the alloys move in a different way to the alcohol inks, and it's a really interesting way that they move. I'm just going back in with a little bit more colour over the top of the alloys in some spots. And then I'll be done. So the actual puffer tool that I'm using is a spritzer tool that you can actually use to spritz with markers, but I'm using it for a different purpose here. All right, so then I got out my paper trimmer, and I'm going to cut these into 1-inch square panels. Now the Yupo that I start with is A4 sized, and I generally cut it down into panels that are 5.5 by 4 1/8, which is generally what I use for my card bases. It's a long story why I do that, but anyway, so I'm cutting these down to basically little inchies, 1 square inch in size. And I did this for all of my panels. So I'm just lining these up so I can cut 4 at a time. I find it's easier to line them up 1 deep and cut across like that rather than on top of each other, because sometimes they can slide against each other if you try cutting them on top of each other. All right, so on to my first card. I'm just finding the middle point of my card first, and then I'm just drawing a straight line straight across the middle. And this is going to allow me to place my first 2 squares, and that's the most important 2. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm lining up the 2 opposite corners with this square with that ruled line. And then I'm doing my second one. Now, it really doesn't matter how far apart they are, as long as the corners are lined up on that straight line. Now, once I've got those, I'm going to get rid of the ruled line in between them, and I'm going to start lining up the others. So I've actually got multiple points that I can line this up with, because the straight edges of the 2 pieces that I started with have to line up with the straight edges of the new piece that I'm just adding. Now this piece, I've got 3 ways to line up. I've got the straight edges of the 2 initial pieces, and I've got the pointy edge facing up of the 3rd piece that I added. So I've got multiple sort of visual landmarks that I can line up with. All right, and I just keep doing that. And when you've got the first 2 down, it sort of gives you a guide to how far apart the other ones have to go to keep that pattern relatively straight. But you've always got the 2 straight lines of the previous pieces, and also a diagonal, sort of lining up the points of each of the squares with the one that's on the same row or column of previous ones that you've added. I hope I explained that clearly, but I am going to suggest a different way to do this in just a minute. So with this one, I decided to make kind of like a triangle off to the side on the left-hand side of this card. So you can see I'm adding pieces that are actually going to overlap the edges, or at least the left-hand side and the top and bottom edges of this card. Excuse me. But we will have some overhang, so I'm going to slice them off. Now, some of these pieces I thought, I wonder if I can fit them into the triangles that are left, and the answer was no. They weren't quite the right size, so those pieces will be discarded. But sometimes you can actually find that when you cut an overhanging piece off, you can use it to fill up a sort of edge piece, a triangle that's left on the edge. So this one, for example, I'm going to cut it off and I'm going to use it to fill in another space so it doesn't go to waste. All right, so it's really important to make sure, especially with these edge pieces, that you've got adhesive right to the edges of your pieces that you're adding. And this last little bit, I just managed to get that in, only just. And that panel is pretty much done. So I'm just getting rid of those extra little bits, and to finish off this card, all I needed was a sentiment die cut from some silver mirror cardstock and a little stamped sentiment off to the side. So that sentiment was from the Hello There Stamp and Cut set from Hero Arts. All right, so I'm just going to show you how I do a different one, and I'm going to suggest a different way that you could do this. I haven't actually used this technique, but it might be a useful way for you to do it if you don't really feel comfortable lining up. So again, I've ruled a straight line down the middle of this card vertically this time to line up my first two pieces. Again, I'm not taking that much care in terms of how far apart those pieces are to line them up. But if you weren't happy doing this technique and lining them up, what you could do is slice two pieces of scrap cardstock that is very, very narrow. Basically, the distance that you want your pieces of Yupo to be apart from each other. So the width of the gap that you're seeing here. And then you could line up those pieces to act as spaces. Pretty much the same way that if you've ever done any tiling, you know how you put spaces in between the tiles to line them up and make sure they don't go all crooked? The same kind of thing, but you could use just a piece of cardstock to put beside your first piece on two adjacent sides, so at right angles to each other, and that would form a V, and that would tell you where your next piece could go. And you could just keep on doing that over and over again with the same pieces of cardstock that you've cut as your spacer. So you can see this one, I made my pattern vertically from top to bottom, and I used the Big Hug stamp and cut set from Hero Arts to add my sentiment, this time in gold, to match the alloy that I'd used on that particular card. Now with this one, I didn't know how much of the card I would be able to fill up because I'm using the leftover pieces from the previous card. So I'm actually lining them up before I rule my line, just to make sure I know where I need to put them, because I don't want to start too far down the card and then run out of pieces, or have pieces on the edge that don't actually take up the whole space. So that's why I'm lining them up first. All right, so again, I'm just placing my first one, and whenever I place my first one, the next one that I place is always diagonally. So I don't do it adjacent to the first one, I do it diagonally from the first one in terms of the squares. Of course, in terms of the card, it's completely vertically, but you get what I mean, from diagonal point on the square to diagonal point on the square. And once you've got the first two, it's not really that hard to line up the rest. I need to make sure that I've erased the pencil lines that I had in the first place. But yeah, once that is done, it's pretty much smooth sailing for the rest of it. And I managed to get this so that the pieces that I'm adding right now line up perfectly with the top of the card. So that was nice. It was fortuitous because I couldn't have planned that exactly without actually ruling them out, but yes, managed to get that okay. And I still had the leftover pieces from these two pieces that I'm about to chop off, and they will form the next two little bits that I'm going to add to the top. So you end up at least being able to finish two cards with a panel that started off the same size as a card front. And sometimes, depending on how big you want your pattern panel to be, you could actually get 3 cards out of it, really. It just depends on how much of the card you want to cover up with these squares. So for this third card, I used the Love You stamp and cut set. I used the U in some metallic cardstock, but then I actually had 2 more cards to finish off, so I used the Happy Thanks stamp and cut set from Hero Arts on these. So I hope you found this video useful, and thank you very much for joining me. Bye!